Hey folks, how's it going? Nice to be back. This is my first video in about 3 weeks. I finally had a light bulb moment, so I thought I'd share my thoughts with you on this topic. Today's video is going to be on Canadian culture and Canadian national identity. I'm going to be talking very briefly in the beginning of this video on the history of the birth of Canada and the ideas that sort of gave birth to this country. And then I'm going to move into what Canadian culture and national identity is today, or at least has been for the last century. Let's get started. In 1867, Sir John A. Macdonald becomes Prime Minister of the Dominion of Canada, which is comprised of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. John A. Macdonald's vision for Canada is important in the formation of the Canadian culture and national identity because he believed that these former British colonies that he was joining together to form Canada would be in opposition ideologically to the idea that the United States was based upon. He believed that the division of powers that formed the United States between the federal government and the individual states was deeply flawed. Based on this belief, he created the Constitution of Canada to give the federal government more power than the component parts of the nation. It's also important to note that he suspected that the United States would eventually try to swallow up the individual British colonies in the north if they didn't band together. He figured that if the individual British colonies formed one nation, they would be easier to defend if the United States decided to invade. So the point of this brief and massively oversimplified beginning of Canadian history is that the very idea of Canada was to avoid being American. That was what John A. Macdonald had in mind. He wanted to make sure that the British colonies in North America remained separate from the United States. Okay, so with that out of the way, fast forward to the 20th century. Obviously, after World War I and World War II, the United States has become a global superpower, and Canada has had the good fortune of sharing a border with one of, if not the, strongest country on the face of the planet at any time in history. With that being the case, as Canada is a population of about 35 million people, as opposed to the United States 350 million people, it would make no sense for Canada to take any policy positions in terms of foreign policy that were contrary to the United States. In terms of foreign policy in the 20th century, Canada and the United States have been on the same side in just about every instance. Canada's relationship with Britain in the beginning of the 20th century was also significant because it could play both sides, so to speak. It could take aid from the United States and it could benefit from good relations with the quote-unquote mother country of Britain. But with the decline of the British Empire after the Second World War, Canada was essentially left with no choice but to cozy up to the Americans, which were so close on their border, which they already had good relations with, and which would develop into a significant trading partner. So Canadians owe the very birth of their country to the idea that they didn't want to be Americans. And by the 20th century, Canada essentially functions in some respects as the 51st state of the United States of America. I would argue that without the alliance between the United States and Canada, Canada would not have any power on the world stage. Canada would have the same international clout as Burkina Faso without the partnership of the United States. As Canada is essentially joined at the hip and literally joined at the border to the United States, Canada tries to maintain some distance in terms of its domestic politics. In contrast to the United States, Canada is multicultural in that immigrants that come to this country are not automatically expected to become part of Canada itself. They are allowed to maintain their ethnic origins to some extent. There are those who say that that is more of a vice than a virtue, but that's a discussion for another video. Canada also has socialized medicine in that the country takes public funds and puts it towards providing health care for the citizens. Once again, there are drawbacks to that system in that wait times are very long for sometimes essential procedures, whereas in the United States you can just pay for a procedure and you can get it very quickly. but there are pros and cons to both systems, and socialized medicine is the one that Canada practices. Another way in which Canada is somewhat distinct from the United States in terms of its culture is that Canada is a bilingual nation. Due to the influence of the province of Quebec during Confederation, Canada has two official languages, English and French, Quebec being a majority French province because it used to be part of the French Empire. While American culture does influence Canadian life to some extent, as any country would that shares a border with a certain country, Canada has attempted to maintain its own identity within its borders. On a global stage, however, Canada just simply is a non-country. The reason that Canadians are so upset whenever their Olympic hockey team gets a silver medal is because hockey is literally the only thing Canadians are known for on a global stage. Canada's literal reason for being in the 1800s was born out of the idea that Canada was not going to be part of the United States. And that backfired somewhat when the United States became the biggest, strongest, scariest nation on the face of the earth, and we happen to share a border with them. Canada's cultural identity seems mostly to be relevant to the people that live here. To anybody who lives in any other country, even in the United States, it would be tough for them to discern the Canadian culture from the American culture because, first of all, Canadians, the stereotypes of Canadians are that we're nice people who play hockey. And so if that's the stereotype that you're starting with, there's not a whole lot you can do there in terms of your national identity. The population and the natural resources in this country are so small and so minor that we have to kind of be satisfied with just simply holding our own distinction from the United States. Trying to make ourselves appear a certain way to anybody else requires a power that Canada simply can't project. Constitutionally, Canada is simply a cobbled together group of former British colonies that simply wanted to try to hold off the tidal wave of supposed American aggression that John A. Macdonald thought was coming. But because we simply banded together for that purpose, Canada has never been able to project anything that they are. They've simply been able to project something that they're not. And in terms of national identity, that's probably a bad place to start from. Anyway, guys, that's it for me on this one. Thanks for watching. Hopefully the next one won't be quite so long being uploaded for the next time, and hopefully you'll stick around to watch it. Thanks, guys.